Hi everybody, it's Mike Stevenson here. So in the video today we're going to take a look at this question raised from a friend of mine about resource groups. So the idea is we're building an integration platform. How should we structure our resource groups to effectively build this platform? And this is a great question, and obviously it's something that you're going to have to decide right at the start, but it affects you for a long period through the lifetime of your integration platform. So let's have a look at some considerations about this. So first off, let's think about the platform that we're going to build, and let's think about the perspectives of different stakeholders in the platform. So obviously we've got developers, we've got the integration manager, we've got architects. So they're going to be very actively involved in the development and the sort of governance of the integration platform. We'd also have stakeholders like your infrastructure team, like your networking team, particularly as you start doing infrastructure level and network level connectivity to other applications. You're going to have your cybersecurity team. You're then going to have stakeholders like business users. You're going to have your senior management team. You're going to have, let me think, so we're going to have people like FinOps. So they're going to care about the cost side of the platform. We're going to have IT support. You might have testers. You might have business analysts, and you might have project managers. Now, if we think about what these different stakeholders do in terms of this question about how do we structure our resource groups, so some people probably aren't going to care at all about this thing. So we can probably, in this case, rule out the business users. The senior management team, they probably don't care of the detail. They just want to know it's set up in a way that makes sense. So we'll take them out for this particular question. I think people like your business analysts, your project managers, again, they just care that it's done in line with good practice. They don't care about the detail of it, most likely. Testers may care about it from the perspective of needing to know where stuff is if they're going to have to go into Azure, but it's more likely they're probably testing outside. So again, they probably don't care. Now, if we think about a sort of racy matrix of the remaining users, so the architect's going to be accountable for the governance of this platform. The integration manager and the developers are going to be responsible for setting that up. Actually, I think I've forgotten one really key role. The DevOps person's clearly going to be responsible for configuring it as well. The infrastructure and networking teams, they're likely to be consulted. So the infrastructure people, you're going to want to have thinking about how resources are going to connect to other resources and how the net going to connect to the network. So they're definitely going to be involved in sort of this setup from a consultation perspective. Cybersecurity are going to be consulted as well, so they're going to be thinking about things like your access controls and stuff. FinOps, so they're going to be informed. So we expect that the output from this decision to how to configure your resource groups is going to produce billing data, and that billing data is going to tell the FinOps teams where these resources live, and that'll drive some impact on their reporting for costs. So they probably need to be informed of what's going on. And I would say probably IT support need to be informed as well from a support perspective. But in a lot of cases, maybe a level 3 support teams might be consulted about the setup, but it's much more likely they're going to be told this is how it's the as-built architecture and how to support it. Now, if we think about the different ways I've seen this configured in various organizations, we have a spectrum of people who configure everything with sort of the minimum number of resource groups and subscriptions right through to the other extreme where there's lots of resource groups and subscriptions. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples here at either end of that spectrum, and then we'll go through some stages to consider how you might think about doing this. So one for all is we have one subscription. We then have we have an integration resource group. Now, what we'd probably do, would probably, good practice would be to at minimum separate environments. So let's say we've got dev, test, and prod. And let's say we've got a bunch of resources in here. So these crosses can just represent the resources to keep it easy. Now, one of the biggest customers in terms of integration platform size I've seen in terms of number of resources has it set up like this, where they've got other subscriptions. So I'll just use another pen. They've got in this subscription, they've got other resource groups that are for different apps, nothing to do with the integration platform. And they basically have everything in one subscription. And that was their decision on how to do this a few years ago. That's one option. Another option that I've seen would be you have a company who has lots of subscriptions, which can be you could be a subscription for dev, a subscription for test, and a subscription for prod. And then you might have multiple resource groups. Now, this is, let's say these are EAI for your integration team. Now, you might have other subscriptions for other teams. It's almost like, I guess, in a way, it's a team-based subscription model rather than an organization-based subscription model. So there'd be lots of these, we'll say times n. Now, in this model here, we'd have, typically you might have something like a resource group for your platform resources in each of the environments. And then you would have resource groups for some of your key interfaces. And then basically you'd replicate that where you've got different resource groups for different interfaces. Now, what starts happening here is it kind of gets a lot more complicated than this all-for-one model where you've got lots of resource groups, lots of subscriptions. If it's, maybe it's as simple as you've got 3 environments, but I've seen customers where you'll have 7 or 8 different environments, and then every resource group's kind of a deployable application in a way. So there's 2 significantly different models here. This one's everything is in one resource group per environment. This one's in one subscription per environment and different resource groups for each ones. And I've also seen models where you'd have a different tenant per environment as well. So sometimes like certainly some of the test environments, you might benefit from having that test tenant as one of the other extremes as well. So question is, do you want to be at one end of the spectrum or the other, or somewhere in the middle? Now, let's think about some of the factors that might affect this. So RBAC's a really key factor. So if we have that model where, we had one sub, and then we've got, so we've got the resource group for dev, and a resource group for test, and a resource group for prod. Now, if we think about the RBAC access, so, years and years ago on the cloud, everybody used to just get contributor, and there wasn't really a lot of thinking in RBAC a number of years ago, but progressively that got more and more locked down. Nowadays, we're very much at the case where most customers are looking for least privilege, which is definitely a good thing to be doing. So you're going to be configuring, the likelihood is you might configure PIM roles as one of the things we've done, or PIM groups, sorry. And the idea is you'd assign a group to a role. And what we often would do is in this model, we'd assign it at the resource group level. So you might have, say you've got Key Vault Key Vault Manager as a PIM group, so you'd have a dev, test, prod group, and a user would request permission to one of these groups, and that group would have permission at these resource group levels. You can also assign lots of other roles. So you might have, like developer role only in the dev one. You might have test operator versus, sometimes you have that contributor role, but you would only ever access that in an extreme exception scenario. We're trying to kind of keep away from that as much as we can. Now, when it comes to RBAC, that model where you've got one subscription with multiple resource groups, and to be honest, even if you had separate subscriptions, the idea is really that single resource group model. You can tend to configure that RBAC mainly at the resource group level, and then certainly if that resource group is used by the entire integration team, that's kind of a way where you can have a decent level of security for your RBAC based on the roles, but you're not making a massive overhead to configure all these permissions. The reverse of that is in the other one we looked at, where we've got separate subscription, and then each kind of app has its own resource group like that, and times however many other environments. So you get one of two choices here. So if you configure your roles and groups, then you just end up having to do it on every one of these resource groups, which is where the management overhead becomes really problematic. And every new app you build starts needing these RBAC roles set up. So if you're going to have this very convoluted resource group structure, you're going to need to think about automation of those roles and setting them up for the new resource groups that you provision. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to keep on top of that. I guess one option might be you might do it at subscription level, but then the trade-off there is if you have lots of resource groups but only one subscription, then you end up you give that permission and it counts for all of your environments. Or if you have lots of subscriptions, you end up kind of doing the reverse of that. So it's quite this RBAC maintenance. It's almost like it becomes the good practice of the roles becomes a massive maintenance overhead, which probably counteracts a lot of the benefits of doing the good practice in the first place. So I think you need to think about, in terms of RBAC, I would say if you're going to go this way, you need to automate. Okay, next up we've got deployments. So if we've got a deployment where we've got that single subscription with one resource group per environment, when we build our DevOps pipeline here and it's deploying to an environment, generally everything's relatively simple because things like everything lives in the resource group. So when you're doing a deployment, it's quite common you might have something that needs to connect to something in the integration platform. So say my logic app connects to my function app and my integration database or something like that. If they're all in the same resource groups, that makes the configuration a lot simpler. Now the reverse, where you've got your pipeline here, and I've got let's say I've got dev, but it has 10 resource groups, and every new app adds another one. When I do my pipeline, I might have to start talking to multiple different resource groups because of the dependencies between things. So let's say if I build a pipeline that's deploying a logic app, but that's in one resource group, a function update for a function in a different resource group, and these things all connect to each other, and then have they got visibility to each other, and have they got the right permissions to talk to each other, and again that config equals more complex. Now you also need to think about, if you've got multiple subscriptions involved, which sometimes happens, then you start thinking about your service principals for your DevOps pipelines. They need to have different security scopes as well. So I think if as a minimum, if you keep your entire dev environment in one subscription in this model on the bottom, then that would be doable. But if you start splitting that across subscriptions, you're going to start finding that makes that DevOps pipeline a lot more complicated. Um, One of the things that when I was asked this question was about accidental deletions. So um, if you take this little script up the top here, so this is from a deployment of a consumption logic app solution. So here we have this new deployment PowerShell command, and we're passing in parameters and stuff. And one of the challenges is you have this. So this is captured out the documentation. You have this mode property here, which by default is incremental. So you can see here the default value is incremental. So that means I'm not going to change your resource group. I'm just going to add stuff to it. The bit that you need to be careful of is this complete one. So if somebody accidentally in your PowerShell to deploy your ARM puts it into complete mode, that would delete resources that already exist. So if we highlight that here, um, that would basically clean your resource group out. So that's a big risk for your deployment pipelines. You need to watch that you don't have that in unless it's fully intended. So that's why it's a default parameter. But what you can do, there's a couple of ways you can handle this. The easiest one's locks here. So if we add locks to a lot of our resources, that means we're just not going to delete them unless it's intentional. Um, so that was a really great concern that the team raised. You could also maybe have your service principal. You could take away its permission to be able to delete. Might be another option for how you would handle it. So that there is things you can do, but you definitely need to think about this scenario. I guess different deployment technologies might handle this in different ways. So Terraform and Bicep are one option here if we're doing an ARM deployment. You just need to be aware of that parameter that somebody doesn't accidentally or deliberately slip that parameter in. It cleans your resource group out. Next up, we've got the consideration of what if I want an application view. So when we talk about resource groups and subscriptions, we're really talking about the deployment view of your integration platform. But often people want an application view and kind of forget that the two things are different. So resource groups are all about how do you deploy stuff, where do you deploy it, what containers does it live in, and then you can manage access and you can manage the infrastructure side of that. If you need an application friendly view, then this is where there's a couple of things that can help. So number one, we've got the new feature from from the Logic App team about integration environments. So you'll see this screenshot here where they're starting to allow support for adding things like an API or a queue or a Logic App to an application so that you can be able to kind of see this view of logically related components. Now, this at the minute's just released its first public preview. There's a lot more things that the team are going to have to do to make this real world ready, because it'll only show you certain things like an API. It won't let you choose the operations and stuff like that. So those shared resources are going to need more work for the team. But this is definitely a move in a positive direction to create an application friendly view, which is what a lot of people are going to want. This kind of logical view as opposed to the physical view. Now, one of the things at Serverless 360 that we've done is a long time ago, 3-4 years ago, we recognized this need for this application friendly view. So this is where in the Serverless 360 console, we've got these business applications where you can create a tree structure here for my integration platform. And I can have folders and nodes on the tree for my common services. And then I can start grouping my interfaces by business area, and then it opens up a lot of features to manage the resources that work together. So Serverless 360 is probably 2 or 3 years, maybe more down the line in terms of maturity than where the integration environment is. And obviously, Serverless 360 is not constrained to just be looking at integration solutions. It's looking at the whole of Azure. But from the perspective of resource group questions, a lot of the limitations and constraints that some of those stakeholders we looked at, the integration manager, the IT support teams. They care about what things are, but they particularly are going to look from an application-centric view, not from a deployment-centric view. So this is where you can create these views that will really help you. Next up, we've got the question about FinOps and cost management. So when we go into Azure's cost management area, one of the challenges for the FinOps person is that the cost management's very focused around the deployment view. So it's it's challenging to be able to look at cost across subscriptions, across tenants. It's challenging to create that business-friendly view of your data. Now, Azure's definitely moving in that direction, but again, there's a lot of work to do, and to get that view that FinOps teams need. So this is where Serverless 360 has created the cost analyzer solution. And again, I can model out the cost for my application. So here I've got my integration platform, and I can sort of allocate the cost to nodes on this tree to help me perform analysis of the data, where I don't really care about where it's deployed or that deployment view. I just bring the cost into a cost-focused view, which again, I think is something that will address some of the concerns and questions people would have about how do I sort of decide what to put in which resource group. And you're thinking about it just from the developer and the architect perspective, but thinking of those other stakeholders and how it impacts them. This is how we can help address the FinOps view of this. So finally, what are our takeaways? So as an architecture question, the answer to this is usually it depends. There's no kind of clear black or white answer. So the things you need to think about are what's your company standard? So things like how do you manage environments? Do you have different resource groups for different environments, different subscriptions? Do you have, what do you do with other applications? Do you have big resource groups, small resource groups, that kind of thing? Trying to follow a pattern that you use in the organization is going to sort of grease the wheels a bit, make everything run more smoothly because you're not doing anything radically different. That's not to say it might not be better to choose one approach over the other if you're finding that you have problems with what you currently do. The big challenge around the decision that you make is it's going to be difficult to change later. So one of the reasons I think that is quite important, if I think about the platforms I've seen, that model where you've got lots of resource groups inside an environment kind of works pretty well when you've got quite a smallish environment. But I think when you've got to a really big environment, I've tended to see having one resource group for each environment and then keeping all the resources regardless of what solution they're there. That's your integration platform in a box. It tends to be less confusing because I think what you tend to find is integrations change over time. What made sense 6 months ago doesn't always make sense now, and it's difficult to like kind of shift stuff around too much. I mean, I know you can move them between resource groups, but there's challenges around doing that. And I think what you would tend to find is the reason you would move, the biggest challenge probably with that single resource group is creating the application view on top of it. But if you use either the integration environment or serverless 360, I think as your platform scales, you'll not be overly concerned that there's a lot of resources in that resource group. Whereas I think the main reason people tend to choose the more granular model tends to be we think we need to group things in small chunks so it's easy to understand, but then suddenly you've got 100 small chunks versus one big chunk. Which one makes more sense? And I think you just end up, you end up trying to address that application view problem through your deployment view. So I think based on what I've done over the last sort of 6-7 years, probably I'd say if I knew the customer was going to be a big environment, I'd probably push more towards the one resource group for an environment, just because I think over the long term it's less confusing. I think, is there any other takeaways? Off the top of my head, I think that's pretty much it for this video. But that's my experience and my thoughts. I'd love to hear what other people think in the comments. Do you see things differently? Have you had the reverse of my experiences, or anything like that? It'd be really good to get conversations. And if anybody has shares their thoughts on a separate video, please feel free to pop it in the comments, and I can have people in the comments can go to your video and we can sort of discuss this topic more. Thank you for listening today. Hope everybody has a great week. Cheers.